The day had started like any other. The boy, only 10 years old, was walking home from a nearby park, enjoying the warm breeze and the laughter of kids playing on the street. He had always been a bright, curious child who loved exploring the world around him. But on this particular afternoon, his path crossed with that of the officer. The man in uniform seemed friendly at first, casually stopping to chat with the boy as he leaned against his patrol car. It was the kind of interaction that no one would have thought twice about, until things took an unexpected turn. The officer pulled out a cigarette, lit it, and handed it to the boy. At first, the boy froze, unsure of what was happening. He looked around, confused and hesitant. People walking by noticed the scene, but didn't intervene, some likely assuming it was a strange joke or a misunderstanding. The boy, feeling the weight of the officer's authority, reluctantly complied. The whole situation felt surreal, and the boy's discomfort was written all over his face. From a distance, his older brother was returning from a friend's house when he saw the interaction. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. Was this really happening? The officer was someone they had seen around the neighborhood before, someone the community trusted. Why was he doing this? A mix of anger and panic set in as the brother hurried toward the scene. He didn't know what he was going to do, but he knew he couldn't just stand by. Meanwhile, the officer seemed oblivious to the growing tension. For him, this was all some kind of twisted power play. But little did he know, his actions were about to set off a chain of events that would change everything. The older brother, a young man in his late teens, reached the scene just as the boy reluctantly inhaled the cigarette, his face wrinkling in discomfort. The sight was enough to ignite a storm of emotions. He felt anger, confusion, and fear all at once. Why would someone in authority, a person who was supposed to protect kids like his little brother, do something so humiliating? But even as his instincts screamed at him to intervene, he knew he had to tread carefully. Confronting an officer directly could make things worse, not just for his brother, but for their entire family. Instead, he pulled out his phone, his hands trembling as he began recording the interaction. The officer hadn't noticed him yet, too focused on what he thought was a moment of control. The older brother's heart raced as he captured every second, knowing this footage could be the key to exposing the truth. But it wasn't just about the video. He wanted to step in, to protect his brother from further harm. Yet, something held him back, the realization that one wrong move could escalate the situation beyond his control. Onlookers had started to gather by this point, their murmurs growing louder as they pieced together what was happening. Some shook their heads in disbelief, while others silently reached for their phones, documenting the incident from different angles. Still, no one spoke up. Fear hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as everyone seemed to wait for someone else to take the first step. The boy glanced at his brother, his eyes wide with a mix of embarrassment and desperation. That silent plea was all the older brother needed. He called out to the officer, his voice steady but firm, demanding an explanation. The officer turned, his expression shifting from smug confidence to irritation. The tension in the air was unbearable, and for a brief moment, everything stood still. The question lingered. Would this be the moment the situation spiraled out of control, or would it mark the beginning of the officer's reckoning? The officer turned to face the older brother, his jaw tightening as he squared his shoulders. The shift in his demeanor was immediate. He was no longer playing a twisted game with the young boy, but now trying to assert authority over the growing crowd. He took a step toward the brother, his voice sharp as he asked why he was filming. The brother didn't flinch. Instead, he held his phone steady and calmly replied, "I'm recording the truth." The officer's irritation deepened. He took another step closer, his eyes narrowing. "You need to put that away," he warned, his tone laced with an unspoken threat. But the brother held his ground. He knew that backing down wasn't an option. The crowd, sensing the rising tension, began to shift uneasily, their murmurs growing louder. Some shouted words of encouragement to the brother, while others pleaded with the officer to stop. Yet, no one stepped in. The fear of authority, the fear of what could happen, kept them rooted in place. The boy, still holding the cigarette, dropped it to the ground and stepped back, his small frame trembling. He didn't say a word, but his wide eyes darted between his brother and the officer, silently begging for it to end. The officer noticed the gesture and scowled, directing his attention back to the boy. It was clear he wasn't done with his power play, but the brother wasn't about to let things go any further. "I'm not going anywhere," the brother said, his voice steady but firm. He took a step closer, his phone still recording. "And neither is this video." His words hung in the air like a challenge, daring the officer to test him. The officer hesitated for a moment, glancing at the crowd that had now doubled in size. More phones were pointed in his direction, capturing every move. He was losing control of the narrative, and he knew it. But instead of backing down, his frustration boiled over. He reached for his radio, calling for backup. The sight of the officer reaching for more support sent a wave of unease through the crowd. Some began to back away, fearing what might come next. But the brother stood his ground, his heart pounding as the weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. This wasn't just about his brother anymore. This was about standing up to someone who thought their badge gave them the power to intimidate and humiliate without consequence. He didn't know what would happen next, but he was ready to see it through, no matter the cost. Just as the officer spoke into his radio, a voice from the crowd cut through the tension. A man, tall and composed, stepped forward, his presence commanding attention. He introduced himself as a local attorney who happened to be passing by. The crowd murmured, their unease momentarily replaced with a sense of hope. The brother, still clutching his phone, glanced at the man, uncertain but grateful for the unexpected ally. The attorney calmly addressed the officer, his tone firm but professional. "You might want to think carefully about your next move," he said, his words deliberate. "Because from what I've seen, this is already a situation you don't want to escalate further." The officer stiffened, his grip tightening on his radio. It was clear he hadn't anticipated being challenged by someone with authority of their own. But the plot thickened. The attorney turned to the brother and asked to see the footage. The brother handed over his phone without hesitation, and the attorney reviewed the video briefly before nodding. He then announced to the crowd, "This evidence will be more than enough to support a formal complaint." His words carried weight, and the crowd began to murmur louder, emboldened by the shift in power. The officer's frustration was now unmistakable. He tried to regain control, insisting that the attorney had no right to intervene. But before he could finish, another voice rang out from the back of the crowd. This time, a woman who claimed to have witnessed the entire incident. She too had been recording, and her video captured angles that the brothers hadn't. With multiple witnesses now stepping forward and videos piling up, the officer's confidence began to crumble. His backup arrived moments later, 2 additional officers stepping out of their patrol car, scanning the tense scene. But instead of reinforcing the first officer's authority, their arrival added a new layer of uncertainty. Would they side with their colleague, or would the growing evidence force them to take a different stance? The crowd's energy shifted again, a mix of suspense and anticipation hanging in the air. The attorney, now holding 2 phones with damning footage, looked directly at the newly arrived officers. "I suggest you watch these videos before making any decisions," he said calmly. The tension was now at its peak, and everyone waited to see what would happen next. The 2 additional officers exchanged tense glances as the attorney handed over one of the phones with the recorded footage. One of them hesitated before pressing play, while the other officer turned toward the crowd, trying to assess the growing unrest. As the video played, their expressions shifted from confusion to discomfort. The evidence was undeniable. The first officer's actions were captured clearly, and the implications were serious. The attorney didn't stop there. He calmly explained to the officers that the video, combined with witness testimonies, would be more than enough to file a formal complaint with the department. The crowd murmured in agreement, their confidence bolstered by the turn of events. The boy's older brother stood by the attorney's side, his hands clenched but his face determined. He had stood up to protect his brother, and now it felt like justice might finally be within reach. The first officer, however, wasn't ready to back down. His face flushed with anger as he tried to defend his actions, claiming it was all a misunderstanding. But the crowd wasn't buying it, and neither were the backup officers. One of them quietly asked the attorney if they could forward the footage immediately to their superior. The attorney agreed, sharing the videos with them while keeping copies for himself and the witnesses. Just as the situation seemed to settle, the unexpected twist came. Another member of the crowd, who had been quietly watching from the back, stepped forward. He introduced himself as an off-duty internal affairs investigator. The man calmly stated that he had seen the entire incident unfold and had already contacted the department about the officer's misconduct. His presence sent a ripple of shock through the crowd, and the first officer's face drained of color. The investigator assured the attorney, the boy's family, and the witnesses that the matter would be handled swiftly and fairly. The first officer was quietly escorted to his patrol car, his attempts to defend himself now falling on deaf ears. The crowd, though still tense, began to disperse, their collective energy shifting from outrage to cautious relief. As the boy's older brother hugged him tightly, the attorney placed a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You did the right thing," he said. The off-duty investigator nodded in agreement. Sometimes standing up is all it takes to expose the truth. Though the family had faced an unforgettable ordeal, they knew this moment would spark a conversation about accountability in their community. And as they walked away, the older brother held his head high, knowing he had fought for what was right, and won. In the days that followed, the videos captured during the incident spread quickly across social media, drawing widespread attention. People from all over voiced their outrage and support for the family, demanding accountability from the department. The story wasn't just about one officer's actions. It became a larger conversation about trust, responsibility, and standing up against wrongdoing, no matter who was involved. The internal investigation moved faster than anyone expected. The officer was suspended immediately, and within weeks, he was dismissed from the force. The department issued a public apology to the boy and his family, acknowledging the harm caused and pledging to implement stronger measures to prevent future misconduct. While no amount of apologies could erase what had happened, the family took comfort in knowing that justice had been served and that their voices had made a difference. The older brother, who had initially been unsure of what to do, became something of a local hero. People in the community approached him to express their gratitude for his courage. He was invited to speak at a town hall meeting about his experience, where he urged others to stand up for what's right and to never let fear silence them. His story inspired many, and he used the opportunity to highlight the importance of accountability and fairness in law enforcement. As for the young boy, he began to recover from the emotional toll of the ordeal, supported by his family and the community that rallied around him. His brother became his unwavering source of strength, proving that even in the darkest moments, there's light to be found in standing together. Their story wasn't just about the injustice they faced. It was a reminder of the power of truth and the courage it takes to confront it. As life slowly returned to normal, they carried with them the knowledge that one brave act can spark change, even when the odds seem overwhelming.